Blackness, noise. The cold wind whistles through the deafening rumble. Nature itself seemed to cry out in pain. In the distance, a deafening crack, dry branches breaking, as if someone invisible was sneaking through the veil of the storm. Slowly, as if through a dream, the picture comes into view. The whiteness of the blizzard fills everything, sky, earth, breath. Nothing can be seen more than a few paces away, everything but one thing, the indistinct silhouette of the rider. He is alone. In this silent hell, where even time seems to have frozen, he moves confidently, as if he were sown from the wind, snow, and silence. He is tall, wearing a worn leather cloak, his hat pulled low over his eyes, his face covered with a scarf. He is indistinguishable from the shadows that dance against the icy curtains. The snow crunches beneath his hooves. The horse walks with a step, tense, as if it senses that somewhere near, trouble. And suddenly he stops. His body tenses a little. He looks down to the right. There is something in his field of vision poking out of the whiteness. A blur, dark, shapeless, like a discarded garment. He stays in the saddle but freezes. The camera slowly zooms in. The stain in the snow begins to take shape. It is a man, a woman, lying on her side, her hair slicked back, her dress frozen to her body. She doesn't move. Lee did not immediately move from his seat. His silhouette froze in the saddle as if it was stuck to the void. Moments stretched like an eternity until at last he slid off his horse, landing hard, with the distinctive crunch of dense snow beneath his boots. The wind hit harder. Snowflakes hit his face like tiny needles, tearing his breath away. He covered his eyes and stepped forward, slowly, groping, as if he feared that everything would disappear as he approached, a mirage created by the storm and loneliness. As he came closer, he stopped. His gaze fell on a motionless body, half covered in snow. A woman. Her figure seemed frail even in stillness. Her hair clumped in dark strands, her cheek pale to a marble white. Her dress, frozen and tattered, clung to her legs. He knelt down, carefully brushing the snow from her face. Her eyelids were closed, lips cracked and blue. Hands folded on her rounded belly as if she was trying to protect what was inside. Snow blanketed everything, but she seemed like a chunk of ice thrown out into the elements. He leaned in slowly, listening. Silence. So silent that he could only hear his own blood pounding in his temples. And then suddenly, barely perceptible, a slight movement, a moment of breathing, a groan, quiet, almost squeezed, as if torn from within by death itself. At that moment, everything around her disappeared. The snow, the horse, and the vast emptiness of the plains. There was only her, and a silence full of deadly menace. He was no longer thinking. Instincts took over. Lee opened his cloak, warm, stinking of smoke and sweat, and lay down beside her, pressing her frozen body against his. The snow crunched under their weight like brittle ice and began to cover them together again, as if the earth itself was trying to take her back. He cradled her head against his and covered her with the edge of his cloak, warming her with everything he had. Her breath was barely perceptible, faint ripples of life, like the last flicker of coal in a dying fire. Her whole body seemed chiseled from ice. He pulled off his glove, reached out, slowly, with an almost reverent fear, and touched her cheek. The skin was icy, a little moisture on his fingers from the snow or her tears. He didn't realize. The wind roared, and he breathed hard, often, as if before a leap into the abyss. He didn't know who she was, but in that moment there was no more important task than to hold her, to bring her back, to pluck her from the ice, from this storm, from the places where the forgotten and abandoned go, as he himself had once almost gone. He could feel her body going more and more limp, her breathing becoming even shallower, more intermittent. Time was up. He couldn't wait any longer. Carefully, but with determination, he lifted her into his arms. Her weight was barely perceptible, frighteningly light, as if death itself had already begun to take her. As he held her to his chest, the hem of her dress pulled back, and he saw a purple stain. Blood. Just below, the roundness of her belly, fragile and defenseless. The storm howled with renewed vigor, as if it wanted to swallow them all at once. He cast a quick glance to the side. No shelter, no road, just the white fury of the wind. He stepped toward the horse, trying to keep his breathing rhythm steady. Every movement he made was precise and measured. He placed her in the saddle, sat behind her, pulled her as tightly as he could, and covered both of them with his cloak, holding her as if she were the last spark of life. The horse spurred on, as if he too realized that too much was at stake. Their bodies merged into a single blur amidst the white chaos. Snow whipped into his face, tears and ice mixed in an acrid cocktail. He stared forward, unblinking. His eyes were a taut bowstring. The face of the woman beside him was almost lifeless, with frozen lashes and a blue tint to her lips. But he could feel her breathing. Barely. Barely. And that was enough. The trees ahead seemed ghostly, silhouettes in a white inferno. Branches bowed under the weight of snow, forming black and white arches, like an entrance to another world. The horse lumbered forward, as if he were walking not on the ground, but on memory. He held her tightly. He felt her breathing grow quieter with each jerk, her weight seeming to dissolve into him. He didn't know where he was going, didn't know if he'd find his way back. But he knew there was no stopping. Behind them, the blizzard was already erasing their tracks. The snow, like memorylessness, covered everything. Doubts, fear, even time. Only the rhythm of his heart beating in his chest. Only her fragility in his arms. Through the storm, through the wall of ice and howling, they disappeared behind the trees. It was as if the night itself had decided to keep this meeting a secret. And somewhere inside him, something trembled. Not fear, not doubt, but the memory of how someone had saved him once before. But this time, he had become that someone himself. Because if he'd left her, he wouldn't have saved her. He would have lost what was left of himself. The light was slowly creeping through the clear mist over the prairie. The tops of the dry grasses caught it first, then the brittle branches of the sharpleaf, and finally the whole ranch. Everything was flooded with a soft gold, as if the day did not yet know what it was to encounter. Marian raced across the fields lightly and freely. Her hair fluttered beneath her broad hat, and her silhouette seemed part of the landscape, not just a person, but the spirit of the land. The horse carried her obediently, as if knowing that on her back was not just her mistress, but the heart of the land. Inside Marian there was a quiet hope. This morning seemed special, when one could dream aloud and believe in the best. She looked at the distant hills and thought of the future, what it might have been like if strangers' hands had not interfered with her fate. Her father often said that she had inherited her mother's strength and her grandmother's gentleness, but Marian herself felt that her dream was to be the mistress of her own life, strong but without losing her tenderness. As she walked back home, she could already see the shadows lengthening on the slopes. In the distance, shutters slammed, dogs barking, the muffled laughter of workers. This was her world, her refuge. But fate had already turned differently that day. Flashback. The evening in the house after the wedding. Marian stands at the window, stroking her growing belly and singing softly, her voice trembling with loneliness. Harland stands beside her, cold and aloof. His hands do not touch her with tenderness. He is silent, as if there were an invisible wall between them. A horseman appeared on the prairie. Elegant, erect, he held himself differently, like a man from another world. His bright eyes read not only his face, but Marian's soul. He spoke calmly, reservedly, asking questions that concealed the game. Marian's father watched from afar with alarm. This stranger could change everything. A celebration in the house. Marian in a white dress, surrounded by guests. But her heart is separated by an invisible wall. Harland stands beside her, his gaze cold and penetrating. Their hands meet. His grip is firm, but devoid of tenderness. In that gesture there is a warning, a game in which Marian was but a pawn. Harland is changing. His smiles are rare, his glances harsh, his remarks like blows. The first blow took her by surprise. A slap, a sharp sound and deafening silence. In return, a cold gift to make amends. Marian found out she was pregnant. Tears of joy, but Harland's gaze is icy. His words are condemnation, her happiness a stain that spoiled everything. He left for a few days, came back drunk, full of recriminations and accusations. She was left alone in a house full of shadows and emptiness. One day he called her on the road, as if offering her the world. On the prairie, there is an invisible wall between them. His face stony, his eyes cold. Conflict erupts. Marian makes up her mind. To leave. To start a new life. Harland shouts, accuses, pushes her off her horse. She falls into the cold snow, feeling the ground go from under her feet. His hooves sound muffled in the distance, a heart being carried away. And behind her, a blizzard begins. White, merciless, consuming everything. Through the dense forest and the rocky mountainsides came the dim light of the setting sun. Lee Grayson walked quietly and confidently, his figure dissolving into the shadows of the pines as if he were part of this wilderness. He had once worn an officer's uniform, a symbol of order and authority, but now he was an outcast, a man with a broken life and bitter injustice behind him. Society had turned its back on him, turning him into a fugitive hiding in the mountains. In every step, Lee felt the weight of loss, the memories of his wife, of the family that fate had cruelly taken away. In his jacket pocket was a withered flower, a fragile symbol of the past that he could not let go. The mountain trails became a new reality for him, harsh, cruel, and free. There was no falsity here, only a struggle with nature and his own demons. Lee learned to live anew. He repaired the old hut, hunted, studied the forest and rocks. He grew stronger in solitude, but inside he kept his fear of getting close, afraid to lose again, afraid to open his heart. Legends of him traveled far and wide. He was respected and feared. Sheriffs avoided his domain. He was more than just a fugitive. He became a symbol of resistance and freedom in the midst of chaos. As dusk fell, the wind turned into a howling gust, whipping up the first snow swirls. A blizzard covered the forest, turning the world into a vast white wasteland. Lee moved through the cold and blizzard, each step a tremendous effort. His breath was ragged in the frost, his eyes relentlessly searching for a saving light. Suddenly, a warm light flickered behind the shroud of snow. Home, a small island of warmth and hope. Lee's heart clenched with a longing for safety and peace, even if only for a brief moment. Inside, amid the flickering shadows and crackling wood, two lonelinesses, Lee and Marian, met, each with a wound, each with pain and fear, but now almost side by side. His appearance made her anxious, but also quietly hopeful, like a shadow of the past bringing salvation. Lee looked tired and wounded, but his eyes burned with a defiant strength forged in the fire of suffering and struggle. There was an invisible thread between them, thin but strong, binding the two who had known loneliness and loss. In the silence was the unspoken truth. No words were needed. By the fireplace, Lee immersed himself in memories. The faces of his wife, taken away by the cruelty of fate, seemed close and at the same time unattainable. The pain of injustice burned in his soul, but his heart burned with determination. He lived not only for himself, but for the truth and the retribution that awaited him beyond the horizon. In Marian, he saw more than a human being. He saw a life to be cherished and protected. Her fragility and strength touched him deeply, awakening his desire to become her shield. In this inner confrontation between past and future, Lee found a second chance. He made the decision to stay. This house, this moment, a temporary refuge on a path that could no longer be turned back. A thin thread of hope hung between them, the first ray of light in a long, dark night. The destinies, which had been running parallel before, were now intertwined. Dangers, trials, struggles lay ahead. Lee had seen the enemy, Harland, the embodiment of lies and cruelty. But now they were together, stronger together. Together, ready to face the future, with challenge, pain, and hope. The dim light of the fire in the fireplace barely shone through the thick darkness of the old cabin, like a tiny beacon of warmth in an ocean of unrelenting cold. The cracks in the walls, covered with dust and cobwebs, held the echoes of days long past, when laughter and voices were heard here, and life was not just a constant struggle with nature and fate. Now the house seemed abandoned, forgotten by all, even the winds and storms. But for Lee and Marian, it had become a fortress, a last refuge before the fierce blizzard that roamed outside the door. The wind rattled the peeling boards, making the floorboards creak and howl in the crevices, as if nature itself were reminding them that this world was harsh and unforgiving of weakness. Lee stopped at the entrance, his eyes roving the corners of the room. Broken chairs, an old cast-iron stove with a rotten door, a boarded-up window through which only the icy light of a winter evening shone. Each object seemed both vulnerable and secure, sheltering them from the hostile world outside. Marian stood just behind him, her eyes watching him with a mixture of wariness and a faint, barely perceptible hope. She was afraid to believe in this rare moment of peace, as if holding her breath, waiting for him to disappear like a ghost. The silence between them became heavy, like a thick blanket stretching across the room. Neither one dared to be the first to break it, afraid not only to reveal themselves, but also to inflict new pain. Tension hung in the air, a mixture of fear, caution, and an inner loneliness as acute as the piercing wind outside. The hut was their only shelter, but inside that enclosed space they were strangers, each with his own hard history, his own burnt soul, his own unspoken wounds. The silence was a reminder of the invisible danger that awaited not only outside the walls, the blizzard outside, and the ghosts of the past inside. But in the midst of this cold and dampness, there was hope. Here, if only for a short time, they could find respite, gather their strength, and prepare for the next battle of fate. This humble house became their first point of reference, the place where the paths of two lonely and wounded hearts intertwined. In the darkness of the cabin hid not only faces and fears, but also the unresolved questions that clutched their souls. An invisible barrier of mistrust and caution stood between them. Lee didn't know her name, her past. She remained a mystery to him, a mystery that could be solved or, on the contrary, doomed to danger. His gaze was cautious, searching for the slightest sign of lie, threat, or betrayal, for experience had taught him that trust was a luxury that could be costly. Within Marian herself, a storm of doubts and fears of her own was raging. Behind the mask of caution lurked a fragile soul, afraid that a new relationship will bring only new wounds. Who was this man, cold and strong, with a hard stare like those who have seen too much pain? Would it be possible to trust him even a little, to open up? Or was it better to stay in the shadows, keeping their secrets, protecting themselves from betrayal? Both were prisoners of their own stories, painful, full of loss and disappointment. But in that silence and tension lurked the elusive hints of something more. The shadows of the past surfaced in their minds, the bitterness of loss, of mistakes, of trying to survive in a cruel and unfair world. None of them could reveal the truth at once. It was too fragile, too dangerous. And yet, beneath the layer of fear, there was a tiny spark, a desire to understand the other, to find in him an ally, not an enemy. Every minute the burden of the unknown grew heavier, but with it grew the feeling that fate had brought these two together for a reason. An invisible bond began to appear between them, thin as an icy web, but strong enough to hold two lonely and wounded hearts in this forgotten corner of the world. The dim light of the lamp reflected softly off the shabby walls, colouring the cold darkness with warm hues. Lee moved quietly and cautiously around the room, careful not to shatter the fragile silence. Marian was emaciated. Her skin seemed almost transparent, but a faint glimmer of life was slowly appearing in her eyes. He gently brought the cup of warm water to her lips, watching as she slowly accepted the relief, as if she feared it was only an illusion of safety. Lee's every move was deliberate and gentle, despite the harsh nature and years of loneliness that had made him tough and hardened. He took his time, knowing full well that haste could destroy what fragile vestige of trust they still had. His hands, used to hard work and survival, were now gently changing bandages, trying to take away the pain that words could not simply hide. In these simple acts, water, food, bandages, lay all his care, quiet and unassuming, like a promise that here and now they were in no danger. Marian was gradually coming to her senses, her breathing more even, her movements more sure. Her gaze flashed less and less with pain and more with hope and gratitude. Step by step, a bridge was being built between them, a bridge of trust based on small acts and silent understanding. In this quiet time together, a fragile thread was born that could connect two broken hearts. Gazes that had previously slid past with caution and suspicion now lingered longer, trying to read each other without words, to understand and accept. In this secluded sanctuary, sheltered from the storms and bustle of the world, hope was born, small but strong. Step by step, overcoming fears and doubts, they were approaching the beginning of a new life, where help and care could become a strength, not a weakness. In the faint light of the lamp flickering on the cracked walls, the air was filled with something new, subtle and tender. Lee and Marian, both accustomed to loneliness and pain, began to see each other not as strangers, but as those who could understand without words. Their gazes crossed more and more often, lingering longer, without fear or alienation. In these silent encounters, trust was born, fragile and quiet, like the first spring ray breaking through the ice. Gestures of support became more than a necessity. They became expressions of a care that could hardly be called anything else. Lee handed water, helped her up, gently adjusted her blanket. Simple acts filled with meaning. Marian responded with slight smiles, barely perceptible touches. More than words. There was a sense of belonging between them, as if fate itself had woven their paths together with invisible but strong threads. Cautious hope, warm and quiet, crept through the cold and fear, spreading through their hearts like a slow, steady fire. It didn't burn brightly, nor did it require confession. It was more like a living spark, capable of igniting a flame in the soul one day. Each day they spent together in that abandoned cabin brought closer the moment when the weight of the past would no longer weigh them down, and the trials to come would seem insurmountable. In the silence, filled with the smallest signs of mutual recognition, a story was emerging, a story of trust, support, and the strength given by those around you when the world falls apart. But along with it, there were unspoken words in the cabin, a heaviness hidden deep inside. Marian feared not only the blizzard and the cruel world outside, but that her secrets, once revealed, might turn out to be betrayed. She held a fear of being caught, a fear that trust would turn into a weapon against her, and it kept her at a distance. Lee carried another fear, of ruining what was just beginning to bud between them. His past was full of pain and injustice, and he knew well how thin the line between trust and betrayal was. He was afraid that his truth would become a heavy burden not only for himself, but for her as well. That fear kept him wary, preventing him from opening up fully, even when his hands reached out to help. The silence filled with these fears became an invisible barrier between them. The internal conflict grew like a taut bowstring, ready to burst if the truth came out. This psychological knot held them captive. Both of them wanted to be closer, but were afraid to reveal something that could destroy the fragile mutual understanding. And yet, despite the storm inside, there was hope in their eyes, silent, persistent, like a glimmer of dawn after the darkest night. They did not yet know how strong they would be when they opened themselves to each other, but the moment was coming, and with it came a tension that was both warm and painful. In the semi-darkness of the hut, where every movement seemed meaningful and full of significance, there was a silent agreement between Lee and Marian, not spoken aloud, but deeply felt. Their gazes met in a brief but decisive exchange where there was no room for doubt. Without words or promises, They accepted their destiny, in which their paths intertwined forever. Together, against the winds, shadows, and adversity beyond the walls of this abandoned shelter. It was the first step in a new chapter, a chapter of struggle where every step requires not only strength, but also trust. The atmosphere inside the hut was filled with a quiet tension, as if the air held its breath in anticipation of a thunderstorm. The outside world, hidden behind the murky glass, was already preparing its trials, harsh and merciless. Their union had become not just a choice, but a necessity for survival. Through the cloudy glass, a thundercloud could be seen, a symbol of the approaching storm, not only natural, but also internal, human. Lee and Marian's hearts beat in unison with a new rhythm, the rhythm of struggle, hope, and an uncharted future. In that moment, filled with silent power and foreboding, they were ready to walk together, against all odds, to face the coming one shoulder to shoulder, despite the cold, despite the fear, despite the unknown. The cabin was dimly lit. The lamp cast a soft, almost honeyed light, and the fire in the fireplace moved lazily, as if it knew that winter was howling outside. The boards of the walls creaked, soaked with cold and time. Everything around him seemed faded, as if life itself had lurked here, breathing quietly so as not to disturb the pain. A blizzard was raging outside the window. The wind rumbled against the walls, throwing waves of snow, as if trying to get at the warmth, to destroy it. The howling was like the voice of old fears, calling to surrender, to go out, to disappear. And inside, it was quiet. An uncomfortable, tense silence. Not from silence, but from the fact that everyone was afraid to say too much. They were strangers, and yet they were closer than anyone had been in years. Loneliness did not separate them. On the contrary, it connected them, a thin thread of anxiety, pain, and silent hope. Marian sat by the fireplace. The light falling on her face emphasized fatigue, not only of body, but also of soul. A wound lived in this woman. She told of being abandoned when everything was falling apart, when death was closer than faith. Her husband couldn't take it, decided she couldn't survive, and left. And everything inside Marian collapsed. The one who was supposed to hold her hand turned away. All that was left was emptiness and fear, cold, viscous, stronger than any winter. But even in that fear smoldered a stubborn, almost childlike desire to live, to save herself no matter what. And the child. Words came hard to her, but she didn't hide. For the first time in a long time, there was someone who listened, really listened. Lee didn't interrupt. His gaze, steady, attentive, didn't judge, didn't pity. He was just there. That meant more than could be said out loud. And suddenly she saw in his eyes, he knows too. Knows what it's like to be betrayed, to be left behind. His story didn't sound loud, but in every gesture, in the way he looked away when she spoke of pain, it read his wound. He told it. Not much, but enough. False accusation, a lost name, years of loneliness. He went to prison for a murder he didn't commit. People who were close turned away. All gone, home, honor, hope. All that's left is the armor. He'd learned to be iron, because he couldn't survive otherwise. But now, here, next to her, that armor had cracked. And instead of fear for himself, there was a desire to protect her. There was no touching between them. There were no promises, just a silence in which two hearts heard each other, unintentionally, deeply. And for the first time in a long time, it wasn't scary. They both carried a heavy past, one that teaches silence, doubt, holding at a distance. But it was that pain, recognized half-heartedly, that became the bridge. There was no need to explain. They knew that every day was a struggle, and it was easier to go through it together. It was not emptiness that lived in the silence, but hope, silent, stubborn, like a spark beneath the ashes. It didn't call loudly, it didn't promise much, but it whispered, "You can start over." Not just to survive, but to find meaning, warmth, a home near someone. Outside the cabin, the blizzard still tore at the sky, the wind rushing against the walls as if it wanted to tear this fragile shelter from its hinges. And inside, the beginning of something new, elusive, but real. A connection, barely formalized, but already important. Not love, not friendship, something in between that needs no name. In the semi-darkness, among the dancing shadows, they sat side by side. Two tired hearts, two travelers who happened to be together, and suddenly realized they didn't want to be alone anymore. The fire crackled, casting light on the walls and faces, and the silence was filled with meaning. There was no need for words. Their gazes crossed tentatively, but increasingly like hands-free touches. There was a sense of power in that silence. Tired bodies relaxed, souls opened a little. Not trust yet, but a step towards it. The familiar fear of being rejected, of being used, was still there, but with each passing minute it receded before something new. Calm. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, but inside the hut there was more than just protection from the cold. This place, this night, had become a point of reference, from something small, but real. And as they stared into the fire, not so much at the flames, but deep within themselves, they both felt it. Here began not only a new chapter of the journey, but an opportunity to be present, to be understood, and maybe, finally, to be saved. Night was creeping into the mountains, covering the sky with grey silk clouds. The wind, as if it had lost patience, beat against the rocky slopes, raising swirls of snow and scalding cold. Their hiding place was an accidental cave hidden behind a scree, half covered by icicles, frozen solid. But it was the one that had become salvation. There was no comfort inside, only dry earth, the pungent odor of stone and dense darkness. But for the fugitives, it was a fortress, the last frontier before a new frontier. Marian could barely stay on her feet, her body shuddering now and then. In her eyes, not fear, but a strange, deep understanding. She knew that the moment had come. A strong contraction twisted her from the inside out, and she instinctively sank to her knees, resting her palms on the rock. The snow was still crumbling from her shoulders, and her hair stuck to her face. Tears flowed, not from pain, but from overload, from the fact that everything had finally caught up. She wasn't ready, and yet she had to go through this. Here, now in the cold and alone. Lee picked her up, laid her down on a bed of clothes and skins hastily spread by the fire. The fire barely flickered, fighting the darkness, but shadows danced across the walls, creating a fragile illusion of life. He lit the lamp, set it next to him. His hands moved quickly but precisely, accustomed to the extreme, to wounds, to death. But now, to birth, the beginning. He knew he had no right to lose his temper. She's everything. Hope, meaning, redemption. He wouldn't let himself think about fear, only action. Marian moaned, panting, biting her lips, digging her fingers into the fabric. Her face was steaming, then pale, almost bluish. Wave after wave, the pain came, grew, and subsided. In between, it was as if she'd fallen out of reality, trembling like a leaf in the wind, but she pulled herself back together, fighting as hard as she could. Lee was there for me, always there for her. He'd bring water, wipe away the sweat, put his shoulder up for her to squeeze. Some moments he just stroked her, on her arm, on her forehead, on her temple. Without words, that touch was all he wanted to say. I'm here. With you. I'm not leaving. She cried quietly, stubbornly, through clenched teeth. He did not avert his gaze. For the first time in his life, he saw a strength that did not require a weapon. She was giving birth to life. Alone, in a cave, in the midst of a blizzard. And it was majestic. Finally, amidst the pain and the screams, at the heaviest and most terrible moment, when the darkness seemed to thicken completely, the first hoarse cry came. Sharp, short, piercing. The cry of a child. Alive. Strong. For a moment, Everything stood still. Even the wind seemed to die down. And then Lee caught himself that, for the first time in months, he was breathing for real. Marian closed her eyes, exhausted beyond belief, with sallow streaks on her face. He covered her shoulders, pressed his forehead against her temple. Then he reached out his hands to the newborn, took it gently, as if afraid to break the magic. The small, wet, warm creature twitched, wheezed, cried again. He wrapped the baby in his shirt, held it to his chest, and handed it to Marian. She opened her eyes and looked at him. Deeply. For a long time. There were no words there, only truth. They had come through the storm. And now there were 3. He crouched beside her, put his arm around her shoulders, touched his lips to her temple, and then, taking his time, carefully, he touched her lips. For the first time, as a man, not as a protector, not as a companion. The kiss was almost awkward, but there was a silence in it that could have been the birthplace of an entire universe. It lasted longer than it should have, and yet it ended just in time. They looked at each other and realized everything. That night had changed everything. Next to her, on her chest, their child was sniffling. A boy. Or a girl, it didn't matter. He was a symbol, a connection, a beginning. Lee put his hand on her belly, the other covering the newborn's tiny palm. All 3 of them at one point, under an icy sky, in an obscure cave that would never be marked on a map. But it was here, in this nothingness, that a family came into being. Outside, the wind had picked up again, whipping the snow into furious whirlwinds. Somewhere out there in the valleys, the hunters were close. The chase had not stopped, but now he knew what he would be fighting for. Not just for survival, for them, for her, for him, for what they had found in hell, a piece of heaven. In the deep silence of the forest thicket, where only sparse branches creaked in the light wind, Lee and Marian found shelter among thick bushes and fallen trees. There was an ominous stillness about them, as if nature itself were holding its breath, preparing for the coming storm. Every rustle could be a signal of danger, and they both realized that the time for thinking was long gone. Marian crossed her arms over her chest, staring tensely at the purple sky near the horizon, the last fiery glow of the passing day. In her tired but determined gaze was a steely readiness to face the battle that could be their last. The wounds of the past were no longer breaking her spirit, but hardening it, filling her with the strength she needed now. As Lee carefully bandaged his wrist, the blood slowly soaked into the cloth. His movements were deliberate and precise. The pain only made his will stronger. His gaze slid to Marian, and a silent agreement met in their eyes. Tomorrow, everything would change. There was no turning back. The moments of silence were filled with unspoken meaning, fear and hope, love and inevitability. It was the moment before the storm, when time seemed to slow down and the heart beat to the beat of the coming danger. The plan was simple but deadly risky. Split up, confuse the pursuers, strike and break out of the encirclement. Every action was a game of survival, their lives and the child's future at stake. They silently checked their weapons, carefully laying out the cartridges. The flame of the lamp cast crackling shadows on their tired faces. In their strained sighs there was a quiet hope, faith in themselves and in each other. The night was thickening, hiding the last rays of the sun behind the trees. Tomorrow would be the final battle, the one that would decide the fate not only of them, but of everything they had fought for. But the peace was shattered by a sharp crack as gunshots erupted among the trees like thunderclaps. Harland's gang burst into their hiding place, shattering peace and hope. Dust rose in puffs, mixed with the smell of gunpowder and burning grass. The hunters moved swiftly and mercilessly, faces hidden beneath shawls, eyes cold and ruthless. Their confidence was reminiscent of predators sure of their prey. But Lee and Marian were not about to give up. Lee clutched his weapon and tried to stand up, but a sharp pain pierced his shoulder. The wound was severe, but he banished the weakness, focusing on survival. His gaze became hard. There was no room for fear. Each shot could be his last, and in that realization was born strength. Shots were replaced by screams, the rumble of weapons echoing through the forest. Flashes of fire reflected in the eyes of the fighters. Lee moved forward despite the pain, as if nature itself gave him the strength to fight to the end. He aimed accurately, drawing death for his enemies. One by one, the hunters fell, thinking the hunt was won. But Lee was proving otherwise. Through the pain and fatigue, he burned with a determination not to let himself be killed, not to break the thread of hope that bound him to Marian and the child. Each shot was not just a defense, but a vow. Marian, hidden behind a tree, supported him, loading his gun and feeding him ammunition, trying to remain calm. Her heart beat to the beat of the battle, fear intertwined with pride in the man fighting for them all. As the hunters began to realize the high cost, some fell without strength. Lee could feel the blood running down his arm, his body losing control, but his will remained unwavering. The enemy must fall. With a last effort, he shot the ringleader, and the fate of the night began to tilt in their favor. The price was high. Lee collapsed, breathing heavily, almost on the verge of consciousness. The dim light of dawn was breaking through the branches when Harland emerged from the mist. His stern face expressed steadfastness, his eyes piercing the space as if tracking every shadow. He walked with the confidence of a man who would not admit defeat, with a ferocity that made his name synonymous with fear. The smell of gunpowder and blood hung in the air, and Harland sensed the presence of his enemies. His steps quickened, for he knew that the fugitives were near and that vengeance could not be delayed. There was an oppressive silence, only heavy breathing and the cracking of twigs. Harland paused at the edge of the clearing, his eyes fixed on the faint light, the sign of Lee and Marian's life. At that moment, personal animosity burst forth. Years of hidden malice and cold calculation erupted in a silent confrontation. It was a battle of souls and wills, for which defeat meant the end. Harland was sure that now he must finish what he had begun. The fire of vengeance burned in his eyes, and his lips were pressed into a thin line, ready to release a vow of vengeance. When dawn finally chased away the night, Lee and Harland stood face to face, reflections of determination and pain. Silently, without words, they prepared for a duel where the stakes were too high for doubt. The first shot rang out sharply, echoing through the forest. The fight moved into close contact, the cold metal of the knives glinting in their hands. Each blow and parry was a thin line between life and death. Lee felt the pain and wounds, but the will burned in his eyes, not allowing him to give up. The glade seemed to hold its breath as it watched this inexorable dance of fate. Lee maneuvered quickly and decisively, adjusting to Harland's lunges. The bodies hit each other, but neither retreated. Too much was at stake. Lee's strength was waning, but his spirit was growing stronger. On an impulse, he broke through, delivering a fatal blow. The metal penetrated deep, and the horror of defeat flashed in his foe's eyes. Harland collapsed, leaving the bitterness of loss and the echoes of battle. Lee, bleeding, leaned on a will stronger than pain. His breathing was heavy, his body weary, but his heart unbroken. This duel was not only a fight for life, but also a symbol of the freedom that was fought for to the last breath. When Harland's last breath subsided, Lee could no longer stand. He collapsed to the ground, his life slowly ebbing away. But even in weakness, a spark burned within, stubbornly resisting the night. The shadows enveloped him, death seemed to be reaching out, but at that moment Marian appeared, tired, wounded, but unbroken. In spite of her wounds, she rushed to him, clutching his shoulders to support him and keep him from falling. Her hands trembled, but were precise and determined. She knew. Delay meant death. Marian used everything to stop the blood, to bring the fragile light in Lee's eyes back to life. The wind whispered softly, as if warning, but there was warmth inside, the warmth of care and unwavering hope. In her gaze burned the desire to save the one who had fought to the last for her and the child. Despite the pain, Marian never gave up. Her love became a living defense, a force that drove away the darkness. Lee felt life returning. He was not alone, and that gave him hope. Night covered the land with silence and peace. Flames flickered through the smoke of the fire, playing on tired faces. The light wavered, reflecting in the eyes, where now there was not only pain and fear, but also living hope. Marian hugged Lee tightly, as if to say without words, they would get through this. For the future. For the child. And in that embrace, amid the ruins of the past and the dangers of the present, a new strength was born, a strength of life and struggle that could not be broken. The dim light of dawn was gently shining through the small window of the wooden house, like a gentle herald of a new day. Silence enveloped the room, and the only sounds were the occasional creaking of the old boards and the light crackling of the stove, where the coals were slowly smouldering. There was a sense of calm in the air, as if nature itself had given respite after a long night of struggle and pain. She lay on his chest, her body still shaking with fatigue, but there was something more than rest in this closeness. It was the strong protection and silent trust that had been built between them in the fire of adversity. Her steady breathing, quiet and measured, melded with his own, creating an invisible rhythm that made it seem as if the whole world had frozen. In this moment, filled with tenderness and warmth, the past, with its wounds and fears, receded. Here and now, in the secluded hiding place, a new life was being born, not just a child, but a family that was finding hope in peace and light. He ran his fingers gently through her hair, a light, almost weightless gesture that held all the tenderness that had accumulated over the long ordeal. Every stroke was full of care and gratitude, as if he wanted to tell her in words that she was not alone, that there was support and strength. Nearby, in the cradle, their child was quietly dozing, a small lump of life, which embodied the hope and promise of the future, bright and new, free from fear and pain. His steady breathing sounded like the quiet music of the morning, adding more warmth and peace to the room. The light from the smouldering stove flickered softly in the wooden cabin, radiating a warmth that seeped into every crevice and curve, displacing the cold and reminding me of the comfort of home. The air smelled of pine resin and the freshness of early morning, a quiet promise of new possibilities and calm after a long night of worry. It was a place where time slowed down, allowing fears and battles to be forgotten, a place where a family was born. Fragile but invincible, held together not by words but by silent understanding and love. Lee sat on the wooden floor, leaning against the cold wall of the hut. In his trembling fingers he clutched a thin sheet of paper, a letter that seemed to carry their whole world with it. Inside it was hope, a long-awaited confirmation that could break the shackles that pulled them into the abyss of despair and fear. The light from the lamp softly enveloped his face, emphasizing his concentration and inner struggle. Every stroke of his handwriting, every word, seemed to be weighed on the scales of fate. This letter was not just a document, it was a symbol of the end of a long and painful struggle, a sign that it was time to look forward. Memories of the ordeal flashed before her eyes, the cold nights, the escape from her pursuers, the fear for the child's life and future. But now, despite the fatigue and pain, a quiet but firm sense of release was building inside Lee. The letter carried the promise of safety and new opportunity. It was not just paper, but a bridge between past and future, between darkness and light. With each line, Lee felt the weight on his heart lessen, giving way to lightness and hope. He knew the journey was not over, but now there was a light ahead that could guide them through the darkness. The very light they sought for themselves, for Marian and their child. In the silence of the cabin, where the light of the lamp softly illuminated faces, Lee plunged into the depths of his thoughts. Every moment lived by Marian's side was proof to him that the struggle and suffering had not been in vain. His heart was intertwined with gratitude and love, feelings that had become an anchor in the chaos of their lives. He remembered all those nights when hope had seemed distant, when fear had clouded his mind, and every breath had been like a last gasp. But now, Looking at the calm face of the woman, he realized that it was she who had saved him from falling, who had given meaning to his existence. In his soul was born a quiet realization. For her sake, it was worth going through any trials, obstacles, and losses. Inner warmth spilled over his chest like a gentle fire that did not let go out even in the darkest hours. It was a confession, not in words, but a deep inner commitment, a silent promise to protect and support no matter what. In that moment, their hearts beat in unison, and the silence itself seemed filled with light. Every breath, every touch was a reminder that true strength lies in love and faith in each other. It wasn't just a bond, but a strong union born of pain, hope, and mutual devotion. Silence descended on the valley like a soft blanket, sheltering the land from worries and storms. The wind had died down, and only rare birds were singing their gentle trills in the sky, small notes of peace and tranquility. Here, among green hills and gently babbling brooks, it was as if a new world had been born, quiet, serene, and bright. Lee and Marian, now a family, walked together, leaving fear and pain behind. Their gazes were tired, but also deeply relieved, as if the ordeal had only made them stronger and closer to each other. Every step was a reminder that now they had a place to breathe freely, where there were no hunters or ghosts of the past. The valley became a symbol of a new life, the refuge they had sought for so long. The warm sunlight warmed their faces, and the soft grass under their feet seemed like a living carpet, created by nature especially for them. Hopes and dreams were born here, free from the shadow of fear. In this peace, true strength was revealed, not in weapons or strength of body, but in love and faith. They knew there might be trials ahead, but now something greater bound them together, a family they would always keep and protect. May this silence be the beginning of a journey where each day is filled with light and peace, and may they forever have a fire in their hearts that can withstand any darkness. Thank you for watching. If you like the story, put a like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. See you soon.